Alright, so we are going to go through some rendering optimization stuff. And here is my basic rendering that I have here. And this is with the default settings of my shaders and my unified sampling set to 2.2. This is what it looks like. Okay. And then here what I've done is increase the unified sampling up to 2 and then rendered this out. You can see there's still a bit of noise happening in the image. And then here what I've done is taken my glossy samples on my shaders and brought them down to 1 and let this thing kind of go and kind of blur out a little bit just so it's a bit fuzzy. If you see here, this is still fuzzy, but it's so grainy because that unified sampling is down. Here, unified sampling is up and we have a nice smooth motion. Here the glossy samples are down, and then here the glossy samples are off. Okay? So here's a 35-second rendering, here's a 46-second rendering, and this is obviously 30 because there's no sampling happening on there, there's no glossiness. So if I go from here to here, you can see there's a definite difference in quality that we're seeing. So along with unified sampling here, which is kind of just like our overall slider for quality, we have these glossy samples on all of our materials. So anytime we take this glossiness below 1, that's going to be introduced. So we want to take that up. So we may want to take it up to maybe 2, or maybe 3, or 4, or 5, or whatever it is. Okay. So you can play with that to get higher quality glossiness happening here. So if you look at this and say, oh, that's a little bit too grainy, then you can pull it up a little bit. And you can see that it also takes a little bit of that highlight away too. So you just have to be careful you don't kind of overdo it. Okay. Now these should go in increments of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. You shouldn't really need anything like that crazy. But okay, so start at 1 on all of these and just see what you need. Okay, and there's also under the refraction, if I take the transparency down, or the glossiness down here, there's also glossy samples there. So I want to play with those as well if I'm going to be using any kind of transparency. When you're doing your test renders, I like to keep all that stuff super low until we're ready to go. So even this would be at 0.2. Okay. So now let's get into just kind of maximizing our final gathering. Whenever we hit render on here, if you watch down in this area, it says mental rate computing final gather points, and then it goes through and actually renders the stuff out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this simple scene and I'm just going to duplicate it minus the ground. Okay. And on this object here, I'm just going to put in a Mia. I'm going to come down to lighting or advanced. I'm going to go to where it says additional color, and I'm just going to click on here and map in a light surface. Okay. So now when I hit render, what we should have is a little bit longer render. Okay, so we can see this here, calculating final gather points. We have this ball, and that ball is kind of going out. Okay, so let me go in here and take the ground plane and just up those samples a little bit. Actually, let me take the glossiness or the reflectivity down on that ground. Alright, too reflective and it's not showing what I want to show. Okay, so right now this ball is illuminated, it's white, but it's really not giving off any coloring. Okay, it's not really going out there and kind of spreading its color around. So I'm going to just go to grab that ball's material again. I'll go back down to the additional color, click that. And here's where it's contributing to our final gather. So I could crank this up. And if I put this in here and render, we should see that that ball is now going to contribute a little bit to the scene. Let's put it up to 5. So we really get an effect of the final gather contribution. Okay. And just for the sake of this lecture, I'm going to put this back up to 960 because I really want you to see the slowness. Okay, so it says mental array computing final gather points. You can see the blue bars are loading here. So part of our render time is actually coming from it just calculating what are called final gather points. Okay, so I'm just going to hit escape. All right, so if you look at this, this is at 16, it's not done yet. So we basically had maybe about 10 seconds where it was calculating just final gather points in this simple scene. Other scenes are going to be much more complex. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to basically let it calculate the final gather points one time for the entire scene and then not have to worry about it again. So under my render settings, under indirect, there's a final gather tracing and a map. That's what I want is the map. I'm going to say enable map visualizer. Okay, so I'm going to go into this region here and I'll just do a rendering. And what this rendering is going to do is it's showing us, here's the final gather squares and whatever else is in the scene. Once those squares go away, I can hit escape. Okay, I'm going to close that. And now inside my scene, it might be hard to see. Let me switch my view color. There you go. You can kind of see that. Probably a little better here. All right, you can see these like reddish, orangish colored dots in the scene. When mental array renders with final gather, it's shooting these dots out, and these dots are what are helping create the look of the final gather inside here. Okay, so essentially the more dots we have, the more accurate essentially it could be. Okay, so that's where we have this point density is how many points are being fired out of this thing. So if I set this to 2, I'll go back to about the same spot and render this again. Okay, once it's done with the blue, I can just hit escape. That's all I want to do is get the blue, the final gather calculated. And now I have a lot more points in my scene. Okay, and you can see in some areas, like here, hopefully you can see it. There's a couple dots here, a couple dots there. All right. So in some of these areas where you have just like a little scattering of dots, we don't really have like all the dots we want. Okay. Now here's where I can go in here and say, okay, let's pretend that I'm doing a still image. And I just want to preview that still image multiple times. So I'm going to just render this again. Okay, so it finished with the dots, with the blue, so I'm going to let it go. Here's my dots in my scene. I'm going to change my map instead of rebuild. I'm going to tell it to be freeze. Okay, so now when I render this, we won't see those blue bars. It'll literally just go right into the rendering. It's already calculated where all those dots should be, so it doesn't need to go back and like recalculate them. So this could save you hours and hours and hours on your render time because you don't have to wait for all of these things to kind of go through and calculate. Okay, it's still going to take some time, but we're cutting that extra final gather time off of our render time. Okay, so you can see how quickly this is going compared to the other one. It's basically a little bit longer than the final gather calculation time is what I'm seeing. Okay, but even if we wanted to see a full rendering of this, we wouldn't have to wait for those final gather points to calculate. So now we'll just let it go until this is finished. And there we go. Okay, so now if I decide I want to change something, let's say I change the color of this thing. I'm not doing linear workflow in this case, I'm just kind of dropping in some coloring. I grab this thing, hit the render button, and that's going to happen in our world super quick. Okay, it doesn't have to recalculate any final gather points, doesn't have to figure anything else out. It's just good, it just works. Okay, so in this case what I've done is just kind of set that up so that it's very easy to do that. Now the problem comes in that, let's say in most cases, you won't have a static camera. So if I were to come up here and render, I'll save my previous image and render the whole scene again. It's remembering where that map was for my other stuff, and it's going to use that map to do this. So I'm probably too far away to even see this. So what it's going to do is it's going to use final gather rays just in those areas where the final gather rays were shot. And then in those other areas, it's not going to use those rays. So we're going to get some funky stuff happening here. You can see it looks like pretty dark right there. Even though we kind of have some lighting in the scene, it's just not is working the correct way. Let me add another area light to the scene just so we can see it. Okay, so stuff back here, we're not getting any final gather kind of bouncing up in here because our final gather wasn't shot back there. Okay, it might be difficult to see with the effect of it in this case, but it doesn't really have it. All right, and if I did something like, do that, like grab one of these objects and move it here, and grab this object and move it here. You can see how those final gather points are still locked in where they were. And when I render, we're still going to render the same thing. But now if you look over here, we have this big bright white light where our final gathering was locked in right there. Okay, and this object isn't really been considered as a final gather emission type object anymore because of where this is. And it looks like there's a light here shining in. That might be from our area light. I'm not sure. Okay, so with animated objects, this doesn't work. Okay, and even if we went to the back of this, we would probably see that this doesn't have any final gather points, so we're not really going to get this effect. But what we can do is instead of taking this to a freeze map, we can make this an off map. So if we knew that we were going to render this from multiple areas, I could jump over to this area, do a final gather map. We wait until the blue is gone. That's final gather being calculated. Hit escape. And now you see that we've added on to our final gather map. So what we'd want to do is just go through this thing. And you can see there's a little bit of blue in here where it's kind of attributing to it. We want to go through this thing and just say, okay, our camera is going to come in from here and kind of circle around and hit this. Oops. And I have an extra thing here where I move that. So I'd actually want to go through and turn this back to on and then rebuild it. Okay, but we'll just ignore this guy here. So I'm just going through and just recalculating some of these areas. Sometimes you'll have a lot of final gather points right in front of your scene and not that many in the background. And the background might look really splotchy, okay? And you'll really see this when you do your final gather if you see like big circles in your scene where the final gather just isn't turning out right. And what we have to do is basically shoot some final gather points on it and then go through and let it figure the rest out. Oops, I'm letting it render the whole thing, I don't need to. Okay, so I've added some more points there. If I'm going to show this side of our stuff, I'd want to do another shot here. And it might seem crazy like rendering this stuff before we actually render it, but my settings are pretty low. Okay, the only settings that are up are my final gather point density is up. And that's just so that I can get enough points in here to kind of cover my butt to render out some good stuff. I could even shoot one from above. Okay, and that took very little time, just kind of shooting those points out. So now I have a good sampling of particles to cover this area here. Okay. So then once I'm done, I just set this thing back to freeze. And then I do my animation on the camera. And then I let it render out and go. And then this, like I said before, is just going to be my flat rendering. So then I could say, okay, well, now that my final gather isn't taking an hour to calculate, I can go to my quality tab and turn this up. I could even take my accuracy in here and turn that up. Well, the accuracy there is not going to do anything because we already adjusted it. Okay, so now we're dealing with simply just rendering this stuff out. That's all we're doing right now is just rendering it, and the final gather is not even being calculated anymore because it's already kind of like stitched into our scene. Okay, so obviously that's going to take some time to do because I cranked up my settings. So the other thing we can do is, let's say that we realized, whoops, we made a mistake. We moved an object, now it's not looking right. I just have to set this back to on, hit the render button, and what it's going to do is it's going to delete our old map and remake a new map. So I'm going to let it go through, calculate the final gather. That's why it looks so grainy here, because it's just using that as a base image, calculating final gather. And now I have my new map. You can see the black on there, or if I go to wireframe, you can see the orange of where that's hitting. Okay, so just a quick way to kind of help speed up some of your workflow. You can definitely see where we have a clustering of final gather points and where we have very little final gather points that we would need to add more stuff in there if we were getting some funky artifacts. Okay, and try to keep these numbers. We could even turn the point density off after we set this to freeze because it's kind of like locked in. So changing these will not have any effect on that. Okay, or it shouldn't. All right, so that's it. So that'll be just another quick way to kind of help speed up working with Final Gather.